I'm the executive director of Maine Historical Society, and we're really thrilled to have you part of our annual Olmsted event. What surreal times we are all in. Really challenging, really different. So I think it's going to be neat to have an opportunity to just think about something special like Beatrix Ferrand, her work, Mount Desert Island, and some Maine things as we're all anxious to be resuming normal Maine lives, I think. And of course, this event was originally supposed to be held in our library in lovely Longfellow Garden in May, but here we find ourselves on Zoom. We're wistful about that on one hand, but at the other hand, we're just thrilled that so many more people can participate. We've had over more than 300 people sign up to be part of this. I imagine many of them will join us, and hopefully we'll be able to reach and connect with a lot more people than who could have actually physically gotten to our campus. So welcome on that front. I also want to thank our partners in this program who've helped spread the word, and really are many of the organizations that love and care about Maine landscapes and gardens and the physical world we're in. That includes the Portland Society for Architecture, our own Longfellow Garden Club, the Maine section of the Boston chapter of the American Society of Landscape Architects, and the Piscataqua Garden Club. We're really grateful to have you and all your people and constituents and friends join us this evening. It's great to have you. So just by a quick way of background, the roots for today's program go back to the really incredible work of the Maine Olmsted Alliance for Parks and Landscapes. For those who aren't familiar, the Olmsted Alliance was founded in 1990, and it really spent about two decades doing incredible work, researching, documenting, and celebrating the role of landscape design in Maine. Fantastic annual convenings, and the real culmination of this was this beautiful book, Designing the Maine Landscape, that really pulled together the survey and illustrated it beautifully. It's a wonderful resource if you haven't seen it, and of course you can buy it through our online store. But it was an incredible legacy that the Olmsted Alliance has created. We were talking the other day, and I think we did our first annual Olmsted lecture in about 2004. That dates a lot of things, but that's getting on like 17. I ran out of fingers and stuff to count on, but we've been doing these Olmsted programs for a long time, and it's been really special. In 2010, the Maine Olmsted Alliance actually merged in with Maine Historical Society, including all the research material they did, and it's really been a wonderful union. At this point, I want to pause and really give a huge, tremendous thank you and shout out to Noni and Charlton Ames. Noni was the founder of the Maine Olmsted Alliance, its driving force, the one who brought it together with Maine Historical Society, and continues to be the inspiration and the champion for putting together really wonderful creative programs like this. So thank you, Noni. I can't see you, but I know you're out there. So with that, we're going to get going with our program shortly. I just want to give a couple housekeeping details. Of course, this is a brave new world. I know we have almost 200 people who are on now. We've been testing the technology inside and out, upside and down, the film, screening, and all of that. And I think it's going to work pretty well. I will also acknowledge it's a work in progress, and we're all learning, and technology has lots of variables. So please bear with us. We're doing the best we can. I think it's all teed up to work quite well. We'll give you a couple instructions. So what we're going to do is I'm going to share a little bit about Patrick and Ann. Patrick's going to say a couple of words to introduce the film. The film itself is about an hour long. When it concludes, we're going to then have Patrick and Ann are going to have a conversation for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions for 10 or so. Because of the numbers and the technology, we're not going to have a live chat where we can see you and talk with you, members of the audience, but you can use the chat function at any point to share questions, and we'll be monitoring that, and I'll collect all of that as we get to that part of the program. So with that, thanks again for being here. We have 4 stars of the program. One is Beatrix Ferrand. One is this wonderful new documentary about her life and career. And then most importantly, we have Ann Sims and Patrick Chassé. Patrick has been a collaborator and a friend. He's a landscape architect and historian. He works in historic landscapes and new landscapes. He's done a tremendous amount of work on Ferrand and the historic gardens on Mount Desert Island. So he's got great personal connections and stories. And then Anne Cleve Sims was the horticulturalist for the Beatrix Farrand Garden Association for 20 years. She led the team that restored the Farrand Design Garden, Hyde Park, New York, where she also developed and continues to run a series of educational programs that champion Beatrice's legacy. She is, both she and Patrick appear in the film, and she is one of the film's producers. So it's going to be great to hear from Matt. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Patrick to introduce us to the film.
Hello, let me see if I can adjust myself here. Okay. For those of you who don't know me and don't know my sense of humor, I'm Patrick Chassé, and the thing that excites me about this program, and also about people learning more about Beatrix Farrand, is that I'm from Maine. I was born in Maine. I was raised in Maine. And Farrand wasn't born in Maine, but she started coming as a child, summers, and it really became her spiritual base, and she took root, and it's the source of her natural history interest and all that sort of stuff. And she came all through her life, and then eventually was a year-round resident at Reef Point in Bar Harbor. So it was very important to her, and I was born I was born when the Great Fire happened that year, and then she died just a few years later. So I never met her, I'd never heard of her, I didn't know about her work or anything. And one of the questions that Anne asked me is, how did I discover Beatrix Farrand? And it turned out to be more interesting than I thought. I'd gone to Mount Desert Island with my family when I was little, but like 10 years old or something. And we just did touristy stuff. We stayed in a small cabin in Salisbury Cove and ate a lot of lobster and drove around, and it was beautiful and loved it. My mother knew it as a child, so that's why we got back there on a fairly regular basis. But when I was in college, I spent a first whole summer there as a student at the Jackson Lab, doing research, because I was trained as a biologist, but I also had a lot of botany that I don't think they know about. And that was a life changer, because I got to explore the whole island, met a lot of local people, because I wasn't just a tourist, and figured out what the community was like, and it was wonderful. And 5 of the people I met that summer were former trustees of Reef Point Gardens and knew Mrs. Farrand very well. And nobody was really talking about Reef Point because it was sort of gone. And Thuya and the Azalea Gardens had appeared, which were wonderful. But it was kind of a sad story to people who knew it well. And a lot of people didn't think that it had to end, but some agreed that it had to end, and so forth. So there wasn't much talk of it. And but people opened up to me, and I learned it, and then I became very curious, and I got a list of all the projects he had done on Mount Desert Island, and I tracked down all the properties, and many of them were just ruins because they had burned in the fire. But there were foundations and footprints, and sometimes parts of gardens left, and plants still growing. And I photographed all of those and made a record and whatever, sort of did a taxonomy in a way of the designs. And I hadn't really been very interested in design before. So that really opened things up for me. And two of the people that I literally stumbled into were on their knees, these 2 wonderful white-haired ladies, on their knees in the wild gardens of Acadia, weeding native plants that had non-native weeds. And they introduced themselves, and then they found out that I had botanical taxonomy courses and whatever, and they drafted me to help figure out fern hybrids that had come up in the garden, which is just about impossible, but I was hooked. and I got to know them quite well, and for the rest of their lives. I mean, they were very close to me, and always had interesting stories about Mrs. Farrand and what her goals were and so forth. So I understand a lot more about her frame of mind and what went on. And that really hasn't been published or addressed very accurately in books and articles and so forth. And there's a strong vein of opinion that she was spiteful and she wanted to tear everything down and destroy it. And it wasn't that at all. And actually the house wasn't torn down as it's described. It was dismantled by her architect. And the parts were used to build her apartments at Garland Farm. So they became miniature versions of the house she had grown up in. And she was very comfortable there and she loved it, and all of her furniture fit and all of that stuff. So it was a transition and an evolution really from her Reef Point life and the public garden. And then she brought all of her favorite plants to her own garden at Garland Farm. And that became evident when because I met Charles Savage, who was one of her trustees, and he had no formal education, but was an artist and was brilliant and read voraciously, and I think learned a lot from her. And then he was the one that designed the 2 gardens that used most of her plants. But she had promised him all the roses, and roses were a big favorite. And that was fine. And he was going to make a rose garden somewhere in his projects. And then she decided she had room for some roses at Garland Farm. So she very delicately tiptoed back and said, may I have some of those to keep at Garland Farm? He said, oh, sure. So there are roses at Garland Farm. But it was really interesting, you know, and she, by the end, it was sort of like giving up a baby. It was her baby. And so she didn't really want anyone to adopt it. She didn't trust anyone to buy it even and keep it the way she wanted. And so she put her architect, who was on the board, Mr. Patterson, in charge. And he was the one that actually disposed of the plants and organized the whole thing and actually subdivided the property. And it's a subdivision, tasteful subdivision, I would say, and dismantled the buildings except for the caretaker's cottage, but the greenhouse and everything else was taken out. He's interesting because I met him and he was actually a mentor. And he was the first designer in the state of Maine to be dually registered as a landscape architect and an architect. And he actually had championed registration for landscape architects. And so he was license number 1. And had an amazing background and worked with Farrand in other places, but really could cover the whole waterfront in terms of his skills and his sensitivities, and really a wonderful, gentle man. So, and he actually was my connection to working in the Asticue Azalea Garden and so forth, because he was sort of the treasured landscape architect on the island to a number of families, including the Rockefeller family. And everybody wanted him to help with whatever they were doing. And so a gift was given to try to start cleaning up and restoring Cluya Gardens. And they wanted him to do it. And he was trying to retire. So he said to me, I can't take on any more projects, and because I want to retire gracefully. And he said, and he knew that I was studying landscape architecture and whatever, and was familiar with the garden. And he said, I think you could do it. And he said, I promised the people who were concerned that I would keep an eye on you and guide you. And I said, that's fine with me. So I really apprenticed with him, which was a great honor. And then he was, because there were no active offices on the island at the time. So then he was the person who went on my licensure application eventually. Um, but that gave me some insights, into designing on the island, and also into sort of Mrs. Farren's heart, when she was dealing with this difficult decision. Now, the thing that triggered it, but wasn't totally responsible, her whole need for transition, wasn't just the death of her husband, who was a big part of that project, but the Great Fire destroyed in 1947, fall of 1947, destroyed more than half the tax base of the town. And of course, a lot of that was cottages. But the town was still there, and the residents, year-round residents were still there, and the school kids were still there, and they had to carry on, and they really didn't have very much money. And Mrs. Farren's funds were running low, and she had actually begun to sell some jewelry to keep Reef Point afloat and so forth, but she was feeling the pressure, and she went to the town and appealed to get tax exemption for Reef Point Gardens. And they basically said, to paraphrase, because there were no nonprofits then, there was no such thing legally. And they said, well, the only things that are tax-free are churches and schools, and you're not either one. So they sort of sent her off, and it was a difficult time for the town, so they may have been kind of brusque. But she was shaken by that, and then still wasn't discouraged totally. And she decided that the only way it could carry on in her vision was to have competent management, because she wanted to retire, and her head gardener, Mrs. Garland, was going to retire. And there was nobody working there that was or helping that was trained or anything. And she wanted somebody top notch. So she went to Mr. Everett, who was president of the New York Botanical Garden, and I believe had been head of Kew Gardens, and said, what do I do? Where do I find a new student who's qualified, who would be great for something like this? And he said, well, from Kew, of course. And she found a Kew graduate who was working at Wisley, and she offered him a job, on a trial basis, to come to Mount Desert Island and live. And she put him up in town at a boarding house. She didn't want him to stay on the estate. She wanted him to learn about the community and the culture, and actually the climate, which he wasn't familiar with. And he actually wrote some articles for the Reef Point bulletins, and she found out that he had taxonomy and everything, and so she put him to work doing the herbarium collection and mapping it and everything. And that's all, most of that is his work, and it exists now, although it's at Berkeley in the botany department. And
Patrick,
yes.
I'm going to interrupt for a second and suggest that you provide some fantastic main context, so that when we get this national story that the film tells, people will understand that main connection. But why don't we show the film and then come back? Because I think what you're teeing up is exactly the conversation you and Ann will continue. So I think just in the interest of time, and know we have a lot of people here who, not knowing their time, we want to make sure we get into the film, and then we'll pick up on where Patrick left off and have Ann join us when we get going. So last bit of housekeeping: as much as we'd like to be control freaks and set up everything you see, some of the viewing options are on your end. So once we start the film and the share the screen, you can hover around and you can change the view a little. There will be a hide the speakers kind of tab that if you hover around, that you should be able to get the thumbnail view that you may be looking at to go away. But at this point, we're going to endeavor to say goodbye to Ann and Patrick for a minute, and I'm going to step back, and we're going to endeavor to run this film. Again, we've tested it. It seemed to work pretty well. If there's any technical issues, just hang in there and we'll keep at it. So with that, it's popcorn time.
In 1907, Beatrix Farrand wrote, "The garden maker must know intimately the forms and texture, as well as the color of all the plants he uses. For plants are to the gardener what the palette is to a painter. He must put his composition down in the open air, with the sky and the trees and the grass as background, while the painter has but a flat surface on which to create his illusion." I've been working on gardens in New York for 36 years, beginning with the restoration of this one, the Conservatory Garden in New York's Central Park. Gardens are good for the soul. They make you feel that your city or your community cares about you. Do you come to the garden often?
All the time.
Do you? That's
Yeah,
nice.
I'm here all the time.
I believe in the promise of beautiful landscapes to make people's lives better. Oh, look!
With the purple, isn't that
Yes,
fabulous?
and no one believed that more than my hero, Beatrix Farrand. She was a groundbreaking garden designer who overcame barriers for women and earned her place at the top of her profession. She understood plants with an artist's eye for color and texture. She mastered engineering and formal structures, and she cared as I do about public gardens.
There's nothing like Central Park.
No, Central Park's the best.
Yes, and you can't put a price on this. I recommend it to everybody that I know.
I have always felt that Beatrix Farrand was a mentor to me, and as I look back on my work in public horticulture, I want to look at her life too, and learn more about this pioneering woman who made my career possible. I have admired Beatrix Farrand for years, but it wasn't until 2005 that I got a chance to work on one of her commissions, the Wyman Garden at Princeton's Graduate School. These babies. And this is lovely. And you're a good thing. Very nice. And these are a beautiful color. A nice texture with that guy, so I'm talking to my plants. And look at those things, aren't they gorgeous? As I was redesigning the Wyman Garden, I thought about Mrs. Farrand and what she would have wanted me to do. It's a sundial, and Mrs. Farrand had it over there, and it was in the shade by the time I got here, which is 100 years later. So I moved it into the sun, and then I designed the garden around it. These things are Mrs. Farrand's. I mean, they were on the plan, and I did that to make it look more like her garden. She was born Beatrix Cadwallader Jones on June 19th, 1872. Her mother, Mary, always known as Minnie, was one of the Philadelphia Cadwalladers and a great-granddaughter of a Revolutionary War hero. She was a social reformer, advocating for better conditions in the city's hospitals and professional recognition of the nurses who worked there. Minnie surrounded herself with artists, sculptors, and writers, including her close friend, Henry James. Beatrix's father, Frederick, was a Jones, a family so wealthy and high on the social ladder that striving members of Gilded Age society in New York were said to be keeping up with the Joneses. When Beatrix was 11, her family chose to escape the stuffy confines of her grandmother's huge summer cottage in Newport and build a house in a more secluded, but no less socially rarefied community on Mount Desert Island off the coast of Maine. The family named their house Reef Point, and it was an idyllic summer refuge for young Beatrix.
That was all a laboratory for her. She was known to have come out of the woods with wildflowers that she had dug up and then planted them near the house. So that was the beginning.
But the sheltered enclave that so transfixed Farrand was also an extension of the rigid world of New York society. And back in the city, her father was flirting with scandal.
To put it bluntly, Dad was a cad and had very public indiscretions in New York, which just horrified the family and that whole social stratum. Actually, the Jones family took up for Minnie, the wife, and the father was sort of put off to the side.
One of Minnie's staunchest supporters during the ordeal was Frederick's sister, an aspiring writer named Edith Wharton.
It really is out of an Edith Wharton novel.
People didn't get divorced in those
You
days.
just
That was
didn't do
not.
it. No. We know the stigma of being divorced in America at that time. And being the daughter of a divorced society
And that-
mother,
yeah.
I think had a lot to do with the fact that she felt that she had to make a life of her own that was outside of society.
Beatrix Jones made her debut in New York in 1890. Attending the usual rounds of parties and costume balls, including one in which she wore a dress inspired by formal garden designs. But even at the age of 18, young Beatrix had set her sights on being something more than a society matron. She came from a family of 5 generations of garden lovers, and her childhood on Mount Desert had kindled a fascination with plants. Now she was determined to pursue a career in horticulture. There was only one obstacle standing in her way. It was not a profession open to women. At the turn of the century, one journalist had described gardening as a congenial, soothing, out-of-doors pursuit to which a woman of taste who loves flowers cannot do better than turn her hand. But I think Beatrix Farrand saw herself quite differently. She was determined to be a landscape gardener, what one leading critic of her day defined as a gardener, an engineer, and an artist who, like an architect, considers beauty and utility together.
No universities were taking female students. MIT took their first female architecture student in 1902, and she had to take her mother to class as a chaperone.
Oh, for God's sake.
But Beatrix met Charles Sprague Sargent, and he invited her to apprentice with him at the Arnold Arboretum.
Sargent was one of the foremost botanists of his day, and beneath his patrician reserve lay a fierce drive that would transform Harvard's Arnold Arboretum into what one writer called the greatest collection of trees and shrubs in the Northern Hemisphere. Over the course of a rigorous year, under Sargent's demanding supervision, Beatrix studied botany, surveying, and horticulture. Never was a great teacher granted a pupil more ideally suited to his hopes, a friend of Beatrix later recalled. Near the end of her training at the Arnold, Sargent arranged for her to visit the offices of Frederick Law Olmsted, one of the designers of Central Park.
She saw all the young men drafting. She thought she needed surveying, all these skills that she couldn't get. Columbia School of Mines had drafting courses and all these things. Women were not allowed. So she hired one of the faculty members to tutor her on surveying at home.
And that's what she's so
And
extraordinary
pieced
for.
it all-
She just knew
found
what
out
she wanted
all
and
the
she did
pieces
it.
that she needed, and she did it.
Yeah. My friends looked upon my studies as a sort of mild mania, Farrand recalled, but they have learned now to regard them seriously. In the spring of 1895, With her course of study under Sargent complete, Farron took her mentor's advice and set off with her mother on a 5-month tour of gardens. It was a trip that would prove to be a transformative experience for the young designer. They visited the Jardin d'Essai in Algiers and the Palace of Versailles in France, where she was captivated by the work of the famous designer Le Nôtre. She was not always impressed, however. She found some of Rome's gardens so squalid as to be melancholy. Parts of the gardens at the Vatican were a maze of tortuous paths leading nowhere. But when they visited the Villa Lante, one of my all-time favorite gardens, it made a vivid impression on young Beatrix. In one of her journals, she wrote, "The beauty of the formal Italian garden lies in its perspectives, effects of space, and the proportions of the parts of the design to each other." Beatrix and Minnie saw almost 150 gardens during their whirlwind tour, and everywhere she went, she took careful notes and photographs of the scale and scope of the layouts, the parterre patterns, and the resources required for maintenance. In England, Beatrix visited 2 places that would have a significant impact on her garden philosophy. The first was Munstead Wood, the home of Gertrude Jekyll, an impressionist painter who turned to garden design when her eyesight began to fail. From Jekyll, Beatrix learned to use sophisticated color theories and approach her plant selection with a subtle new palette. At Gravetye in Sussex, Farron struck up a friendship with William Robinson, the renowned author of The Wild Garden. What was important about The Wild Garden?
His big point was that the formal garden should only be near the house. And then as you went outward from the house, especially in a large property, it should get more natural and more informal. And that was a really big idea. She visited him regularly in England. And he became a mentor and a friend for life.
Let's look at the layout. By telescoping this down, Farron's trying to make it feel like the garden goes on and on and on and on. And so when you're doing your gardens, think about movement in your garden, symmetry and asymmetry, okay? Because if you want to sketch out some stuff first and erase a little bit, you can.
The Green Teens are young people who want to help their communities by learning about horticulture. Today, they're designing their own gardens, with Beatrix Farrand as their inspiration. Farrand designed this garden, Belfield, for her cousin Thomas Newbold and his wife Sarah in 1912. It was intended to be an intimate family enclosure and included a vanishing perspective that embraced William Robinson's idea of increasing wildness as one moved away from the house.
It was like walking through a rainbow because like when you first come in, there's like pink, but it's not all the same color. It's like different. It goes from light to dark, and then it like makes you go that way towards the white, and then you come around and then back to the darker colors. It's like, yeah, it's like art.
Right.
I want to see. Oh, look at that.
I got
Hey, what are the red things you've got?
red things. Those are picnic tables.
Oh, for people to sit and enjoy the place. When I design gardens, first thing I do is put in places for people to sit. So because it has a message, you know, come be here. We want you to come. I think that's very nice.
Thank you so much.
So you go pick some fruit, go to the pond, look at the ducks, walk back, get some fruit, walk through.
So it's all an experience.
And then there's like a yoga space.
Oh.
So you can do like yoga because, you know, it's like peaceful and quiet.
Yes, yes. I've been doing this for 40 years. You try to learn, but you can never quite get your hands on time and weather. Somebody said gardening is the slowest moving of the performing arts. And you think you might know how that plant's going to behave, but they always fool you. They always fool you. They do something different every year because they're alive.
In 1896, fresh from her travels, Beatrix opened her own office on the top floor of her mother's house on East 11th Street in New York City. This was quite unusual for someone of her class to be taking on a profession as a woman.
There was a report in a New York paper that said she was out there in her fisherman's slicker and boots, and she didn't have a society parasol.
She would never
she
carry
was directing the cruise, and this was just, you know, earth-breaking, literally.
In the first few years of her professional practice, Beatrix Farrand was able to land a number of important commissions up and down the East Coast. It is work, hard work, and at the same time it is perpetual pleasure, she exulted. I do not envy the greatest painter or sculptor or poet that ever lived. It seems to me that all the arts are combined in this. As her practice was picking up steam, Farrand was also establishing herself as an outspoken advocate for open space. It is not too late to urge upon New Yorkers the absolute necessity of acquiring a park system, she wrote in 1899. Boulevards planted with trees and kept free from heavy traffic should also lead to the parks from the densely populated portions of the city. Farrand's early work in writing attracted the attention of a group of distinguished designers who were seeking to formalize their new profession.
When they decided to form the first society of landscape architects in the world and actually coined the term landscape architect, she was the only woman signer of it in 1899. So she's considered the first woman landscape architect.
She was a pioneer, wasn't she, Patrick?
I think so. She was even a pioneer among other landscape architects because she was promoting native plants, and she wasn't doing what I call facsimile gardens, which were big. Everyone was doing Italian gardens or French gardens. She could do gardens with some of those characteristics, but also could do just wonderful, undreamt of things.
Because she was educated in all those things, but she didn't spit them back out. Not everyone was impressed by the new designer. Frederick Law Olmsted had once dismissed her as a dabbler, and prestigious public commissions that often made reputations were still awarded exclusively to men. If Farrand wanted to break down these barriers, she was going to have to prove herself again and again. In no small part because of Mrs. Farrand, women like me have been able to have a career in public garden design. Mine started when Betsy Rogers and the Central Park Conservancy gave me the chance in 1982 to restore the conservatory garden in Central Park. It was all overgrown. It did seem dangerous because there was no one in there. The city was totally polarized racially and economically. It was in fiscal crisis, and they cut out the funding for parks. Finally, people started paying attention. I had to teach myself how to raise money, go to people, friends, ask for help. Of course, everyone said we were mad. People around here won't appreciate it, just really quite awful. Horticultural snobism. They would say, pointing in the direction of East Harlem, they will destroy it. The outcome was that they were dead wrong. People began to come back. It was so exciting, and it was the plants creating a beautiful space and making people feel happy. I did collages
when I was a painter. And what is this but a collage?
Pretty soon I was painting on a very large canvas, which is the city of New York. In 1912, Beatrix Farrand at last received a major public commission when she was hired to design the landscape at the Graduate College at Princeton, including the Wyman Garden I restored 100 years later. Her work was so successful that by 1915, she would be appointed Princeton's first consulting landscape gardener.
She felt that the plants had to be as close to each of the buildings as possible. This gave her the opportunity to create some wonderful walk spaces and lawn areas and open areas
That were uncluttered with plants.
The sustainability of her plant palette meant that she would find the right plant eventually for the right spot.
We're sitting right in front of a tree that she planted.
This old Katsura tree was the ideal plant and planted in the right place. 100 years later, and we're still clipping them.
Yes. Farrand's ideas for Princeton broke free of the traditional design conventions of her time. She trained different varieties of trees and shrubs to grow up the sides of buildings, allowed for elegant and proportioned open spaces, and spent time watching the students. Where did they go? And then she put the paths there. And that is what we now call desire lines. Princeton's supervising architect, Ralph Adams Cram, argued that Farrand's ideas compromised the architect's vision for the buildings. And he and other men on the grounds staff dismissed her as the bushwoman, always out in the field, agonizing over the precise placement of trees and shrubs. Not surprisingly, Farrand didn't back down from her ideas and usually prevailed. She remained Princeton's consulting landscape gardener for nearly 30 years. We all know that education is by no means a mere matter of books, she once wrote, and that aesthetic environment contributes as much to mental growth as facts assimilated from a printed page. No life is well-rounded without the subtle inspiration of beauty.
She left us great landscapes at Princeton, at Yale, at Occidental College. They've become part of the fabric of our lives. People grow up, get educated, fall in love.
And then go off into life and remember those things.
On a brisk fall day in September 1915, Beatrix Farrand found herself standing in a boggy piece of land in the Bronx, trying to figure out what to do about the roses. She had been commissioned by the New York Botanical Garden to design a home for what NYBG hoped would become a world-class rose collection. The fact that Farrand was taking on this kind of a project at such a prestigious institution was a testament to the upward arc of her career. In the fall of 1913, she had opened an office at 124 East 40th Street in Manhattan, staffed with an assistant. A few prominent commissions soon followed: landscaping for the New York City home of the banker J.P. Morgan, and through her work at Princeton, a project at the most famous address in America, the redesign of the East Garden at the White House for President and Mrs. Woodrow Wilson. Despite the awkwardness of the New York Botanical Garden site, Beatrix was undaunted. Recalling a design principle she had learned from Charles Sargent, she intended to make the plan fit the ground and not twist the ground to fit a plan.
This was a bowl, and it was not well drained, and roses don't like wet feet. So an elaborate tile drain system went in, and then the beds were laid out in this wonderful triangular pattern. The centerpiece is obviously this gazebo, and it makes a hub for the spokes of the paths, as well as a prospect from which you can look at the beds.
At the New York Botanical Garden, Farren combined the classical forms she loved with the rigorous botanical principles she had learned from Sargent. The NYBG collection of roses, more than 7,000 in all, were organized by plant families and meticulously cataloged and labeled. The new garden will be at once a museum of roses and a popular school for all, the New York Times observed. Whether they wish to grow a plant or two in a home plot or develop a millionaire's garden, and will offer material for the professional student, florist, or botanist.
She appreciated science and also geometry. Those come together in this, which they don't often do in other rose gardens.
Almost 20 years after entering the profession as a landscape gardener, Beatrix Farren's career was thriving, and she had also found someone with whom to share the journey. While she was working at Princeton, she was invited to dinner at the president's house. There, she met a tall, tweedy, 44-year-old professor of history at Yale named Max Farren. A courtship ensued, and the romance surprised both families. Max's sister-in-law caught a glimpse of Farren supervising a large crew of men on the Princeton campus and exclaimed, "If that lady really wants Max, she'll get him." Edith Wharton was delighted. "Hold on to the inestimable treasure of your understanding of each other," she wrote to her niece that fall. "Build your life on its secure foundations and let everything you do and think be part of it." They were married at Minnie's home in New York City on December 17, 1913, and settled down to live in New Haven.
They married late in life, and yet they had long, long happy marriage. They had an amazing compatibility and a great intellectual connection.
On a January day in 1921, Farren arrived at a sprawling, hilly piece of land looking out over Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C. The property, that included a Victorian mansion much in need of renovation, was called the Oaks. It had been purchased the previous year by the American diplomat Robert Bliss and his wife Mildred. As Beatrix walked around the property with the owners, what she saw was a daunting but exhilarating challenge. With steep slopes of as much as 100 feet dropping down from the house to the creek below, the garden represented not only a complex engineering test, but also an opportunity to incorporate many of the styles and influences that Farren had accumulated during her work and travels. After her tour, Beatrix dashed off a 6.5-page report outlining her vision for what would become known as Dumbarton Oaks. It was a series of garden rooms and carefully orchestrated vistas that moved the visitor effortlessly through the radical topography of the site. "You've got it exactly in every respect," Mildred Bliss wrote Farren, "and I can't be patient until you get back here and start to realize your and our mutual dream." I've been coming here since I was a little girl, and I've always thought this was the most beautiful place in the world. What's wonderful about this place is that it is a combination of art and plants. Color, line, form, texture, repetition, scale. And this was really one of her greatest works of art. What is so unique about the structures here in the garden?
One of the things is the sense of enclosure within these rooms or terraces, and each room has a different flavor. And as you're coming down the hill, you get glimpses into the next room with pieces of ornament or with plants. And so it draws me, even after being here for 20 years, into the next room.
Yes, it's kind of a wonderful trick.
It is.
Adds some suspense.
It does indeed. This garden is outside of time. Its beauty transcends. I've noticed when I bring people into the garden that within just a short period of time, they rise above the feelings that they had when they came and are lifted up.
Construction on the vast project began in earnest in 1923. But as it progressed, Farrand had to keep in touch with her globe-trotting clients as they moved from one diplomatic post to the next. She kept up a steady stream of correspondence and often sent multiple drawings of every feature, piece of furniture, and ornamental detail. Over 1,200 in all. She built full-scale mock-ups of critical parts of the garden. So when the Blisses were actually on the site, they could understand her ideas. Looking back, Mildred observed that never were the owners so persuasive as to insist on a design which Mrs. Farrand's inner eye could not accept. Dumbarton Oaks was underway, but little did Beatrix know that seeing it to completion would take her more than 2 decades and represent the most monumental challenge of her career. In 1927, as Farrand was supervising a design studio with a full slate of impressive projects, news arrived that would upend her carefully orchestrated plans.
She was really on a roll, and then all of a sudden her scholarly husband, Max Farrand, gets a job offer of a lifetime to be the first director of the Huntington Gallery and Library in San Marino, California. So one can imagine the discussions around the breakfast table about what to do about this. There was no way that he was going to turn that down.
Beatrix would now be almost 3,000 miles away and a 5-day trip by train from the most important project she had ever undertaken. While Max found his new post at the Huntington congenial, for Beatrix, California was a professional setback. 2 talented designers, Florence Yock and Lockwood DeForest, dominated the landscape field on the West Coast. Cut off from the tightly knit world that had provided many of her early commissions, Beatrix found herself shut out of many important jobs. Worst of all, the extensive grounds of the Huntington remained under the iron grip of William Hertrick, Henry Huntington's longtime head gardener. Beatrix tried to make the best of the situation, designing the garden at the director's house where they lived, working on the master plan for the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, and finding consulting work on the campus of Caltech. But Caltech treated her like a volunteer, while paying Florence Yock for similar work at the same time. Finally, Farrand coldly informed the university that my half-charitable, half-amateur status is not satisfactory, and moved on. While her prospects in California seemed bleak, Farrand's girlhood community of Mount Desert Island in Maine once again proved to be a sustaining and nurturing wellspring of her career. Of all the projects she did on the island, the most ambitious was the one she designed for John D. Rockefeller Jr. and his wife Abby in Seal Harbor. The garden would be set away from the massive 100-room mansion called the Eyrie, and it would serve as both a destination and a cutting garden to fill the house with fresh flowers every week. It was an irresistible challenge for Beatrix, a chance to work with the native plants of Maine and to create a breathtaking array of flower borders. When you bring someone here, you take them very slowly down the spirit path. These statues, they're Korean. They're scholars and generals. This is a wonderful spot. The sculpture of it. And the frog is just in the right place. Isn't that sweet of him? And then there are all these different kinds of moss. So there are loads of textures. I mean, just look at that. You just can hardly resist patting those babies. They're so beautiful. There's a little water going through there, and the moss covers the, I guess it must be the soil or the rocks. Ah, I love it.
The Spirit Path was really catalyzed by a trip that Mr. and Mrs. Rockefeller took to Asia in 1922. They'd been collecting Asian art and porcelains and things for years, but they didn't know about the culture from which it sprang. The Ming tombs made a big impression of the formality of this grand alley of guardian figures. And they visited the Forbidden City Palace, which was in ruins. It was surrounded by a pink stucco wall with gold tile roofs. That idea came home with them. They wanted what Mrs. Rockefeller called a Chinese garden. Mrs. Farrand wanted the Spirit Path planted in native plants.
That was so avant-garde of her. Today, people think they just thought it up, and she was doing it then. We go down to the end and come back. And a good garden always has a surprise. There's a raised bed here with the wall behind it, deliberately planted so that you can't see in. Okay, so then you come to the gate and you stand here, and then if you're bringing a visitor, you turn around and you look at them because their mouths fall apart and they go, oh! You seldom get to see this much color all at once. The smell here, oh my goodness. I've been coming here for 47 years. I never get tired of it. Never cease to feel that great jolt that you get from it. So Mrs. Farrand and Mrs. Rockefeller knew what they were doing. The Spirit Path was all about serenity and quiet, and then, wow.
It's the most ambitious flower garden she ever did. There were 600 plants on the list. It was overpowering.
I think that the soul of the visitor is stimulated by all that wonderful stuff. And then you turn to this, and it's much more peaceful, much more serene.
The use of native plants and background of woodlands was unusual. Almost everybody else was trying to Europeanize the American landscape. And no one focused on the fact that America had unique landscapes of its own into which you could insert traditions from different cultures.
In the late 1920s, Beatrix Farrand could have lived quietly with Max at the Huntington, content with an already distinguished body of work. Instead, she kept designing and building landscapes at an astonishing pace. When she visited friends and clients, she would often prefer to stay at a nearby hotel, so she could work late into the night without disturbing them. And she continued to travel back and forth across the country, often taking an assistant along for part of the journey.
She used to dictate memos and things on trains and then put the person off at the next stop to take
go
a
back
train
to New York.
back and
I
to
love
type it
that.
out.
The Rockefeller Garden in Maine was in full swing, but it was her ambitious plans for Dumbarton Oaks that would highlight Farrand's unique command of every aspect of garden design. What makes Dumbarton Oaks special in terms of Mrs. Farrand's whole career?
Well, this is one of the most interesting gardens she did because it's one of the most challenging. I mean, it's got incredibly complicated topography, and she had to deal with so many challenging slopes, which she resolved in part through terracing and in part through just letting the natural topography appear. She let the forest come right up to the house in some places and pushed the lawn out into the forest in others. So she created this sort of tension between the city and the forest.
As you descend through the formal gardens, you would descend down into these so-called wild gardens that were designed, but were very, very much based on William Robinson type of planting. And it's all situated in a natural stream valley.
You were telling me that you had bulbs that have started coming up that were there when Mrs. Farrand planted them.
Yes.
How beautiful. Do you think she put these bluebells in here?
This is all her. She planted all of these. The two pieces were obviously designed as a whole.
Yeah.
It was also the complement to the formal gardens. So many of the views radiate out into the wild garden. It was meant to be part of the experience. And in her era, this park was highly maintained. There were thousands of bulbs and streamside plantings. I mean, she really tackled something of quite a large scale.
I think that blending of the sort of European formality with the wild garden concept that the English and the Irish were advocating is unique. In a way, this therefore becomes an American garden.
Yes.
We're fortunate that Dumbarton Oaks has survived. 100 years later, we can see exactly what she wanted to do and what she achieved, and it's brilliant.
I want to keep it as poetic as possible, she said, and make it the sort of place in which thrushes sing and dreams are dreamt. Dumbarton Oaks and the wild garden beyond its walls would eventually become open to the public. And Beatrix Farrand crafted detailed instructions to help transform these private grounds into spaces that everyone could enjoy. Farrand's commitment to the public was on my mind when in 1987, I was asked to design gardens in one of the most urban places in America, Bryant Park, right in the middle of Manhattan. Just as they said you can't do anything nice in the conservatory garden, they would say you can't possibly fix Bryant Park. 5 acres of degradation. The Parks Department wasn't taking care of it. I had no idea there would be such public interest in the project.
Who did they call on but the superhero of public parks, Lyndon B. Miller?
There were only 2 entrances and exits, and there were these huge high hedges. And so people felt they'd be trapped in here.
I collaborated with the landscape architect, Laurie Olin. who opened up the park and focused on giving people a beautiful, safe space to enjoy. Movable chairs were added to give them a sense of control. I put lush gardens on either side of the main lawn to bring a connection with nature back to Midtown Manhattan. The more people there are, the safer the place is. The message that people hear is, we did this for you and you're worth it. In 1928, while still working in California and supervising the ongoing work at Dumbarton Oaks and the garden in Seal Harbor, Farren took on another challenge. John D. Rockefeller Jr. had begun building a network of carriage roads on Mount Desert in what would later become Acadia National Park. And he was committed to making them open to the public. Once again, he called for Farren's help. The ambitious project, which covered 82 miles of roads and connecting footpaths and 13 bridges built of stone from local quarries, involved a significant amount of blasting and clearing. Rockefeller hoped that Farren would be able to restore the roadsides in a way that both healed the landscape and maintained the view. Place, isn't that sweet of him?
It's one of her great unheralded projects because they were blasting, which left a lot of rubble and scars. She designed the plantings with 99% native plants, so that would all be invisible. And she did it on the condition that she would not charge for it, because he was doing it out of his own passion, and she wanted to try to match that.
Her collaboration with Rockefeller was a meeting of two strong-minded people who, to their great delight, saw things the same way. Please know that there is no road which I build for which I do not covet your gracious interest and skillful consideration, Rockefeller wrote her in one typical letter. Mr. Rockefeller and Mrs. Farren went over every square inch of the roads, thinking how to make them more beautiful for the public. She was always painting with plants.
Farren drew strong parallels between nature and design landscapes. And one of the most eloquent arguments she made was for the creation of Acadia National Park. She was an early supporter. She wrote an article in which she articulates the value of nature and the value of public access to a beautiful place like that.
And see, that's why she's my heroine. And
Yeah.
I've watched what those places do. I think every person has something inside them that needs a connection with nature. I've noticed that during national tragedies, people tend to rely on the natural world to ground them. In 2001, when the World Trade Center buildings came down, they were only about 6 blocks from a garden I had designed in Battery Park City. Despite the devastation, the rescue workers used the park as a refuge during their lunch hours. Everything kept right on blooming through the smoke and the ashes. On September 12th, I was looking out the window where I live 100 blocks away and thinking about my poor city, and something happened that caught the eye of the media.
My Dutch bulb grower called up and said, I'm so upset about what's happened to New York, and what can I do? And I said, Hans, have you got any extra bulbs?
Within a week, he'd found 1 million of them, and he donated them.
Yellow is the color we've adopted in this country for remembrance.
Working with the Commissioner of Manhattan Parks, Adrian Benepe, and New Yorkers for Parks, we planted in all 5 boroughs, in places where they hadn't seen a flower in years.
New York City will be the golden apple, with a yellow ribbon of daffodils winding through every borough.
We planted bulbs with the families of firemen and policemen.
Since September 11th, J.A. Reynolds has been trying to come to terms with the loss of his son, Bruce.
This was his playground. He grew up here when he was 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. It got me back again into the garden. We have to find some way to perpetuate their memory. And I don't think that there can be any better way than turning to the earth.
In March of 1941, Max Farrand resigned from the Huntington, and he and Beatrix left California and moved permanently to Reef Point in Maine. They shared a dream of transforming her childhood home into a center for public horticulture and research. The object of Reef Point, Beatrix wrote, is primarily to show what outdoor beauty can contribute to those who can be influenced by trees and flowers and open-air composition.
She wanted to open up gardens for people, just ordinary people, to come and look at. It was a happy time at last, and the two of them could work together, taking a family home and converting it into a landscape study center.
Nothing quite like Reef Point had ever been tried before. A private home transformed into a botanic garden, specializing in native plants and dedicated to spreading ideas about horticulture.
It was a study garden. Everything was laid out in beds, and herbarium sheets were made for every single thing.
Don't you wish we could have gone there, and I would have liked to have been one of her students?
So. I think so.
In a sense, Beatrix was coming full circle, returning to her horticultural roots as an avid student of Charles Sargent's at the Arnold Arboretum. And standing behind all her efforts was her husband, whom she called my golden Max. But in the spring of 1945, Max Farrand's health began to decline. And in June, he died. Beatrix reflected to a friend about 30 years of happy companionship with a great teacher, a scholar, and a charming gentleman. Without Max for support, Beatrix continued to try to realize their dream at Reef Point.
It developed into really a major botanic garden with herbarium and all the things that you need, all the seed packets from all over the country. I mean, who else was doing that as an individual garden?
Beatrix began publishing a series of newsletters and started writing a weekly column for the Bar Harbor Times. And she opened her gardens to the public in 1945. One visitor recalled that Beatrix put a sprig of white heather in my buttonhole when we said goodbye. Then, on September 5th, 1947, a wildfire swept across the island, destroying almost 20,000 acres, including a sizable portion of Bar Harbor. Miraculously, Reef Point was spared. But the future of Farrand's dream was in doubt. Despite attracting 50,000 visitors overall, there was no endowment for the center, and her own resources were dwindling. Amy Garland, her head gardener, was aging, and efforts to find a skilled horticulturist to replace her proved fruitless. In the end, Beatrix felt she had no choice but to shut Reef Point down. What appalls me, and seems so dramatic, is that she took her life's work in those plants and she said, take them away. There's a bit of an anger, don't you feel in
I think
this?
so. Or in frustration.
Yeah. I always have felt that she was depressed and she just said the heck with it.
I think her standards for the garden were so high, and she could see the difficulty of ever trying to maintain those standards without the proper staff and without the resources that were required. She couldn't bear to watch it go downhill.
It has taken all the courage I can muster to have arrived at this decision, Beatrix wrote in May of 1955. But it is better to be of good courage and arise and do it than have to face deterioration of the gardens and waste the resources of the library and collections. Unable to afford the upkeep, Beatrix had the house torn down. Her old patron and friend, John D. Rockefeller Jr., agreed to underwrite the cost of saving her most remarkable plants, and they became the foundation of 2 new public gardens. At the age of 83, Beatrix Farrand was now looking for a final home. Amy Garland and her husband Louis were planning to retire to a small farmhouse surrounded by 100 acres, not far from Bar Harbor, and they invited her to join them. She accepted and constructed a separate wing for herself and her maid, Clementine Walker. As she settled into her modest surroundings, Beatrix Farrand had one more garden she wanted to design.
She brought all of her favorite plants, which had to be winnowed down to a much smaller list, and is very telling, and made a little formal tripart garden that the apartments looked out onto. Her companion, Clementine, liked hot colors. So Clementine looked out into the hot garden, and Beatrix's sitting room looked out into the cool garden.
I love that. Here she has a very simple rectangular space, and everything is small. I love that you can sit on the sofa and see what she saw. This is what she chose after a long, exciting, and complicated life.
She didn't stop. I mean, when she got to her little cottage, she made a new garden, and she kept her standards right to the end.
Very astonishing woman. Beatrix Farrand lived on at Garland Farm for 4 years. She received an honorary degree and the rank of professor from Yale University, a doctorate of letters from Smith College, and the Garden Club of America gave her its Medal of Achievement. She died at home on February 27, 1959.
You can go into one of her gardens and learn about this necessity to adapt to changing climate, changing times. She had long-term associations, and over time made sure that those landscapes would endure.
In her gardens, people experience nature and art at the same time, just the same way they were 100 years ago.
She came out of this very society background, and she struck out on her own and became something modern. And that's what a pioneer is. It's somebody who breaks the mold.
Gardening is a gentle art, Farrand once wrote. And yet it needs imagination, strength, and perhaps more than anything else, the vision that sees the future through the present and bravely works toward that vision.
Wow. That's wonderful. I feel like we need to pause and breathe to digest that. But I'm so happy to turn it back over to Patrick and Anne to talk more about so many wonderful themes and connections to Maine that were raised there. I'll just remind folks that you can go ahead and send us any questions by chat or by the Q&A button under there. And Patrick and Ann will probably talk for about 20 minutes or so, FYI, and then I'll rejoin for maybe 10 minutes or so of discussion. So please stick around and join us and enjoy their conversation. If you have to go to dinner, we also understand that. So thank you so much. And back to Ann and Patrick.
Great. I have to say thank you to you, Patrick, for offering your immense knowledge of Beatrix Farren to this project. And, you know, I don't know where we'd be without you, and for being a co-star, really. And it's just, you're just so fantastic and charming, and we're really appreciative. But I would love, if you wouldn't mind, to hear a little bit more about Garland Farm, because it's such a poignant moment in her life that she came to this beautiful place, she created this beautiful place and her own little garden. And I just want to hear a little bit more, because I know how involved you were in saving it, and just, you know, how that happened.
Well, that, as I mentioned before, I mean, I consider Garland Farm a reincarnation of Reef Point on a smaller scale, almost like an architectural sourdough starter.
Yeah, that's great.
So forth. And then, and it's interesting because although it's a very modest sort of apartment, the scale of it has high ceilings, and it has those big French doors, and all those came, you know, all the trim and everything came from Reef Point.
Yeah.
So antique furniture fit and whatever. And it was a really amazing way to sort of transplant one's life and shrink down at the same time. We're all worried about how to shrink down, except in this time of COVID when we eat too much. But I gave a lecture. I knew Garland Farm existed. I didn't know where it was because it's quite far out of town.
Mm-hmm.
I knew it was in an older sort of Cape-style house that had been described to me, but I thought it was closer into town, and driving around, I never saw anything that matched. Mm-hmm. And the actual house is an 1820 house. Mm-hmm. So it was built the year Maine was confirmed.
Wow.
This is the bicentennial this year, and the owner, Mr. Thomas, at the time, was one of the signers of the charter or whatever to start this, to separate the state of Maine and make it a free state. So it had an interesting history. This little piece was added on the back. It's right up against the road, and the widening of the highways had taken a lot of the land in front. Mm-hmm. But the Garlands, I think, were more or less keeping an eye on Mrs. Farren. Yeah. And there was a passage between her apartments and the main house. Right. And they went back and forth as they needed and so forth. And then the gardens were built and everything. And there was a barn and a garage. And I mean, the largest Sergeant cherry in the state of Maine is in the yard, and it's one that she brought there and planted, you know. Mm-hmm. And the largest Cornus moss, state of Maine champion, and so forth. So some of those really live on, those ideas of her. And the way I found it was that I gave a lecture on Mrs. Farren somewhere, the Bar Harbor Historical Society or one of the other interested parties on Mount Desert, and this elderly woman came up to me afterward and introduced herself and said, "I live at Garland Farm."
Oh, wow.
And the gardens are still there. They're not what they used to be, but everything is sort of there. And if you'd like to see it, I'd love to have you come for tea. And I didn't follow her home, but I accepted the invitation. And delightful. And she had moved there from California because her daughter and son-in-law were trying to move her to Maine, where they could sort of help with her and where her grandsons were and everything. And they decided to buy that duplex arrangement so that her family and she and, oh God, I forgot her name already, her companion, who was her mother's French maid, actually, from way back, could all be there together.
Right.
Interesting thing that sold the elderly woman on it when they looked at the property was it had a wall in the living room because the ceilings were high. It had a wall in the living room that was big enough to hold a large Japanese screen with a garden scene on it that she and her husband had collected in Japan after the war. Because he was part of the reconstruction project there. And they had lots of interesting things, but that had to be out. And so that, sealed the deal, and they moved in and whatever. So I got to know the family and whatever. And at one point, Mrs. Eveland, the elder Mrs. Eveland, couldn't manage on her own and went to a senior facility locally. And her daughter called me and said, "Mother's apartment, we can't, we can't keep it open, and so we think we're going to rent it." And we thought, "You might be the perfect tenant." And said, "Well, I already have an office and a house and whatever, but I can use another studio space, so I'll rent half." And it was to divide them into to have two different people in the two different apartments. And so I did.
Wow.
And I really got to know it seasonally and everything. And I couldn't find a plan. I could find some lists and things, but most of the documentation had been taken out of there. And I had a wonderful Suardia.
Oh, beautiful.
Very happy and bloomed.
So no wonder, Patrick, that you're able to channel Mrs. Farrand, because you've done this deep research and you dwelled in this beautiful space. That's incredible.
And so when my friend Christina came from England and said that she wanted to come on a tour and said she wanted to help if she could, and I said, "Well, come back in the fall. We're too busy now." And she came back. She got to stay there, which she thought was fantastic, and really.
It's a dream.
She inventoried everything in the attic, which included trunks, travel trunks with stickers on them, some of which had been Mrs. Farren, some of which I think had been Edith Wharton's.
Oh, wow.
They were lined with newspapers to date things, and so there were all sorts of treasures.
Oh, I imagine.
For clues. And then I was working at New York Botanical Garden at the time. And so I dug into their library and archive.
Right.
And found a magazine that had published an article on that garden after Mrs. Farren died.
Oh, I see.
Garland was still taking care of it and trying to keep it the way it had always been. And it had a plan in it.
Wow.
And that's the plan that's in the film. And that's the plan that we restored it to.
Yeah, yeah.
And the critical catalyst was when Mrs. Evelyn passed away, and that in Maine an estate has to be settled within a year of the death. And she passed away, I think, in October, as I recall. And there were no summer people around. There were no garden people around. There was no one to run to and say, "Help, we've got to buy this."
Yeah.
Save it. And I had already taken people through when they visited the island, people who were involved in garden conservancy and various historic things, and everyone agreed it was very interesting and significant, but it was a big leap. And so the first person I went to was Roger Milliken.
Oh, yes, right.
He had been put under the board to be the next generation of the family, sort of in continuity. And he caught something because he became a tree collector. He turned his business in I think it's South Carolina, one of the Carolinas, into an amazing campus, got an ASLA award for trees and whatever. Ooh. And that's where I heard the opera story.
Right. Oh, goodness.
And but he said, well, I'll write you a check. And this was like at Christmas, because some families come back to Maine for Christmas.
Right.
He said, on one condition. And I said, okay, what's that? And he said that both of my siblings match it. Mm-hmm. And so that was the first big thing that sort of put us over the top in terms of thinking it was possible. And then we went into action trying to raise more money. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, most people wouldn't give unless it was a 501c3, mm-hmm. and so forth. So it organized the whole the institution, and dropped the papers and used the same lawyer that had been used some of the time at Reef Point and who knew Mrs. Farrand.
Right.
So,
interesting. So this was the Beatrix Farrand Society then, in its formation.
Yeah, that was founded with 3 warm bodies and a lawyer, and then
amazing.
And then raising the money, and then we applied for National Register listing and went through all of that, and that helped, and then that really got it rolling.
Mm. What a gift to all of us that we can go there now and see, and the beautiful garden restored, and the hallowed ground, I have to say.
But what's very interesting that not many people know is that, think about her mindset and just leaving Reef Point and it being dismantled. She was very modest, and she really she didn't want any sort of a monument to her.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And also very modest in the sense that very private. And
private, so, yeah.
As in her donations to Berkeley, there's very little correspondence, and there are no bills for projects, and everything is just, it's design and ideas, and else is too private. So, and her intent was, which shows up in her will, that if she were the last of this foursome to die, the whole new wing and everything would be taken down, and the farm would be restored to its condition before that was built.
Huh.
Be erased.
Huh. Wow.
She wasn't the last to die. Good. Yeah. So Amy Garland survived, and then
kept it.
The owners were sympathetic to gardens. It was a wonderful garden club woman, Goff, and they kind of kept it going with Amy Garland giving advice on the side and so forth. And so that's why it survived that intact.
Exactly. Yeah, quite intact. It's interesting when you talk about the correspondence, because of course, as filmmakers, we were, looking to dig into whatever correspondence we could find. And the Rockefeller, side of the back and forth as well, of course, as all the correspondence at Dunbarton Oaks was just such a wealth of information. And I am so charmed by the letters that went back and forth between John D. Rockefeller Jr. and Farrand as they were working on the Acadia carriage roads, and gives us just a feeling for their friendship and mutual respect. But again, I think that Acadia legacy, especially in Maine, is important for people to know about, because the landscape is, it's subtle, and it's It's
then
natives, right?
can't tell it's been manipulated that dramatically.
Right.
And
Well, until we see the blasting and the rocks, and you're like, oh, they needed to do some serious work.
where those stones came from that are used as along the sides, and they're nicknamed Rockefeller teeth.
Teeth.
And they're all now, so they look, almost like they just hatched there. In their correspondence, which I went there, I helped David and Peggy Rockefeller with some restoration things and some planning, some future planning, not all of which has come to pass yet. But and so got in pretty deep on it and got access to all the archives, and went out to Berkeley and all that stuff. But the interesting thing about the correspondence between those two, which is different than the correspondence between Mrs. Bliss and Mrs. Farrand, is all went through Mr. Rockefeller except for a handful of notes.
Not Abby.
Not Abby, but she obviously was consulted, and he would start the letter. What I loved about it is because it was only one letter. We didn't have Farrand's letter.
Right, we only had that side, yeah.
Would repeat her comments from the previous one and suggestions, and then Mrs. Rockefeller feels X or Y and go into it, and then put all of his own, thoughts into it and whatever. So it was very rich, and in terms of the thinking and the design process between client and.
Well, and she was a real collaborator. I think that's what we keep seeing over and over, like these long-term associations. And then the fact that she was so respectful of their idea and their thinking, and she was sort of a conduit to what they wanted. And again, it shows her modesty and her lack of ego in a certain way, that she would just, really work to make it their gardens.
Yeah. Well, they, a little sidetrack on Rockefeller Farrand history is that Nelson was born in Bar Harbor, Maine, because his mother was due in the summer, and apparently her obstetrician or whatever, I think, was from Blue Hill, not from the island, but they wanted to be close to him when the time came, and they rented a house 2 doors down from Reef Point.
Oh.
And that's where Nelson was born. So technically, he was born in Maine. So because I'd always wondered where Mr. and Mrs. Rockefeller connected initially, was unless in something of hers or whatever. And I discovered that it wasn't through that Bar Harbor connection, which had been local, meeting for drinks or something.
Right.
It was back at Kykuit.
Oh, yes.
Really done a formal garden to go with the conservatories there, but they're gone now. Some of the walls and stuff are still there. And I went down and discovered that, and that's much earlier. So they had worked together way back.
Yeah. But long-term relationship.
Germinated relationship. Close and on Mount Desert. So, and speaking of Mount Desert, the other thing I didn't get to put into my windy introduction was that, oh God, I just forgot her name. Not Sydney. Who was the narrator?
Oh yeah, Lyndon Miller. Yeah.
Lyndon's family has been going to Southwest Harbor for years. So she grew up there and still goes.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably, I've never asked her, but I bet that's where she first heard about Mrs. Farrand. I don't know if she ever saw.
And the Rockefeller Garden was a huge influence on her.
And then, of course, Thuy Gardens and the Astor Azalea Garden became the prime depositories for the plants that were moved.
Right.
And they wasn't mentioned, they were designed by her former trustee, Mr. Savage.
Right. Who was also, wasn't he the owner of the Astaku Inn?
Yeah, he
Yeah.
was the manager. And so he had access to that because it had to be done quick.
Wow.
You know, go out and shop for land and all that sort of stuff. And then he was the trustee for the Thuyer property, which had been actually built by a landscape architect, but was owned by the town. It was given to the town. And then he was the trustee in charge of maintaining it and everything. So he could tinker over there if he wanted. And so he did both of those things.
Those are wonderful garden spaces, and just to think to have her plants and her azalea collection and
And I have a letter from her because people conjectured that, she wasn't happy about it. She was so sad about losing everything in it all. And, but I have a copy of a letter from her to Mr. Savage, like a couple years before her death, saying people are extolling the beauty and the virtues of what you've done in Northeast Harbor. And I also heard from somebody way back that occasionally she would be driven there by her chauffeur and parked along the road to watch
to see the progress.
She didn't get out and walk around, but I mean, she was aware of it. And then she wrote a lovely letter to him, basically saying, bravo, this is wonderful and it makes my heart sing, sort of thing. And so that's wonderful.
That's a happy ending.
And her happy ending, because people have looked for ages for her burial. We know where the French maid is buried in the Catholic cemetery. I found her.
Oh, really?
Found the Garlands in the cemetery, I think in Somesville, but we couldn't find Beatrix. And there was a notice somewhere, public notice, that she had been interred somewhere on the island. Well, that was false. No, not on the island. In her family plot in Pennsylvania or in New York or something. And that didn't check out. She was cremated and her ashes spread in the bay around.
Oh, that's beautiful.
They're retied, I think.
That's wonderful. And no monument to her then?
No, well, now I think Garland Farm Service and Dumbarton Oaks, as long as it lasts, but a lot of things are gone.
Yeah.
Really in bad shape. And
well, we're hoping, we've been getting some wonderful responses to the film and people who have said, oh, our property had a Beatrix Farren landscape once, and, look, sort of trying to dig into the archive at Berkeley and see if they can find some original plans. And so it's exciting. We'll see, maybe there is some, some revival yet to come.
Yeah. Well, there could be, and there actually could be reproductions if somebody likes the design well enough.
Exactly.
That would be an honor. But I've had clients approach me because they're very excited about buying an old house and land, and I go and I think this looks kind of familiar, the footprint, and it was a Farren garden, but they weren't at all interested.
Oh.
Anything with it, which it happens even more now. That's swept away and replaced with their own.
Yeah, their own
statement.
Imprint. Yeah. Wow.
So it's important about the ones that are being preserved. I know somebody that just popped on the screen.
Hi, Steve.
All I can say is you're creating this desire to just get in the car immediately and go to MDI. I was on the corner right by the coup this past weekend, and I didn't get a chance to stop and go in, but I wanted to desperately.
I'll go.
Okay. Well, I know we had a handful of questions. I'm not seeing them right now, but they're about to be sent to me. So
okay.
So we may have a couple to answer. Anne, tell us, because I think also exciting news is that this film is going to be broadcast on PBS. It hasn't been scheduled yet in Maine, but tell us about that.
No, we are. We have a series of broadcasts over the summer through PBS and various stations. We had the first one was June 1st in New York City. and the surrounding area. And so it's just, we've got, you know, a lot lined up. We're working on Maine, but the nice thing is the film is streaming on pbs.org between now and, well, it started June 15th, but till July 15th. So if you want to, you know, send it to friends and neighbors and pass it along, you can just, you know, get it right online. So it's exciting.
We'll post that information on our website or somewhere as a follow-up, just FYI everybody, so you can get to those resources.
Great.
Yeah. One question that just came in is, where did she get all of her plants, especially the native ones? What were her sources? Patrick?
Nurseries.
Yeah.
Were collected locally. And one of the things I found out from, and it wasn't considered that horrendous then, because most people were taking native plants away and putting in non-native stuff. But the from the two wild garden ladies that I got to know very well, and they were working as volunteers in the wild gardens of Acadia, which was within National Park, but the National Park would not let them collect within the National Park. So on collecting trips with them to Schoodic Peninsula and other places, which were great fun, to collect just specimens, really, not great swaths of anything. And then they were all labeled. Somebody who didn't know anything about plants could visit the Wild Gardens of Acadia in season and see what would be blooming in the park if you could find it, or if you something, you might be able to identify it that way. But a lot of collecting, actually, I found out a great source for some of the wild material that I used was blueberry farmers, because bunchberry dogwood even, and you know, of course, hazelnut and all these things are considered weeds, and sometimes they get to be huge swaths. And of course, if you start doing everything with nasty chemicals, it affects more, and the crop too. So they were very happy to, because they have to wait a year between harvests for the plants to sort of recover and so forth. And so during that waiting year, we were allowed to go in and dig out actually sod of ferns and whatever, and pay the farmer. And so he was happy because he was being paid to get rid of his weeds. And then I also discovered that there are many huge boulders in these fields that the farmers couldn't remove. And so on that same year, when it didn't hurt anything, if we went in with heavy machinery and took out the beautiful lichened boulders and paid the farmer, it was a win-win. And I think some of that's still going on, although I don't know how much is going on this year, because I think things are pretty quiet in terms of new projects and everything.
Patrick, another question we had is, what currently is the accessibility to the Rockefeller Gardens? You know, when and how can people visit? And
it's more open now because with the passing of Mr. Rockefeller Sr., it's gone into another phase, and I think it's open several days a week. It's by appointment still, and I don't know what COVID is going to do to all that. But the organization in charge is called
the Land and Garden Preserve.
Land and Garden Preserve.
Right.
The preserve, and they have a website.
Yeah.
And I think you can even find all that out on the website, and then I think there's a number to call, or maybe you actually could make a reservation on the website. But it's much more accessible now.
Yes.
Or will be under normal conditions. It's probably well spaced now if it's open at all. And so that's good. And
worth the trip. Absolutely transformational to be in that space.
Yeah.
Another question we got was just somebody asking to remind us of the Berkeley connection a little bit more. Yeah.
Yeah, so she sent her entire archive out to the University of California at Berkeley. She searched and searched for the suitable home, and I don't know, Patrick, you can correct me, but I heard that she gave, at one point, she had given a volume or two of beautiful, rare books to Smith College, and they had, you know, the the botanical garden there. And they didn't write her a thank you note. And in fact, at one point she contacted them to say what worth would they, give the books that she had donated, and they said $1 each. And she she didn't like that response, and so I think she crossed Smith off the list for leaving the archive. But Patrick, tell us, did you know a little bit more why she chose Berkeley?
A little bit more, but and as to Smith honors her greatly now. And
yes, oh, absolutely.
Responsible for their wonderful and innovative horticulture and ecology and design program.
Design, exactly.
So, but anyway, she didn't have a lot of faith in Harvard. And I must say, knowing what I've known about collections that have gone through there, I think she was very prescient about it. And so she was looking for an institution that would really use them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not sell them off and then not just use them as an exhibit, but they would be used. And Berkeley was quite a new academic program in landscape art. And apparently they had a very charming chairman who actually came east and saw Reef Point and saw her library and saw the prints and everything. And so it all went to, after it had been purged of personal information, it all went to Berkeley.
I have to just say one last thing about Smith is that this spring we had meant to be there to show the film as a public lecture, and because of COVID we couldn't, and so they were able to stream the film out to 100 students in their landscape design program, and we got the most beautiful responses from these young women who were greatly inspired by Beatrix. So that's a happy Smith story.
That's powerful. And we got a question about where I would imagine in the answers in the film credits, but maybe on your website, just if there's a list of the participants, like the architects who were interviewed in the film. Is that available on the website, or just the credits, or? Yeah,
you'll see it in the credits, and we have the full credits listed on the website, so you can just run down. But okay. Yeah, we had such amazing people contributing to the project.
Yeah, great. Well, maybe just as a last comment, so we talked a little bit about PBS. I've got questions too about people wanting to see this on an ongoing basis. So they can do it through PBS for a period of time. And you have a website that people can keep up to date, learn, contact you, so they can buy a DVD, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely, okay. Yes.
Okay. Great. Well, we'll send a follow-up email out to everybody who's been here with us today, just to kind of connect to some of those resources. We've been going on for quite a bit, but I want to thank Patrick and Anne for giving us this wonderful evening. Your interest and love for Beatrix and sharing that Maine and national story with us is really wonderful. So thank you to both. And I want to thank Noni and Ames again for being really the inspiration and the driver to make this happen. So thanks to you all for doing this.
Oh, and thank you all so much for having us. It's just been a pleasure.
Yeah, and thank you to all of our guests. One of the things Maine Historical is really excited about the future, with all the questions before all of us, is this ability to use Zoom to connect with people much better. There's many people interested in a lot of the topics we're all interested in about Maine, and it's hard to gather people physically. There's so many logistics. So hopefully this is a first step in connecting with more of you. Please do give us your feedback. Send us email, any comments about how well this worked for you, any issues you had. We're learning, and we want to make this a great experience. So thank you all out there for joining us tonight, and we hope to see everybody very soon. Thank you.